These are two of my heroes, Albert Hofmann and Carl Jung. Jung was older, of course. He died in 1961. Albert Hofmann died in 2004 or 3. So, but they were both from Switzerland, one from Basel and one from Zurich. They didn't know each other, and I think they're two alchemists. And Switzerland is the home of the largest concentration of alchemy. Basel is the, alchemical museum, and long tradition, centuries old tradition of alchemical experimentation. It's really interesting that their work was so interesting. But see, Jung did all these fantastic explorations of the unconscious layers of the psyche, and he wrote 4 of Jung's 20 volumes of collected works are about alchemy. They are alchemical texts. But he was not a chemist. Hofmann was a chemist who knew nothing about Jungian psychology. Nothing whatsoever. But in fact, he was not aware of this connection, of his connection to the alchemical tradition, until I talked with him about it. But he had a mystical vision when he was a child, when he was walking in the woods, and as a 9-year-old boy, and he had several mystical visions, but he had this vision of all of nature, and himself included, was one vibrant whole, where he felt completely encompassed, safe, protected, in his core and in everything. And he had no language to describe this. He said to himself, he had this thought, and he only told this story much, much later, 50 years later, that, I'll never be able to describe this or paint it. I think I'll become a chemist. Because in the vision, it was nature. And chemistry, matter. It was matter. Nature, matter. And chemistry was the science of matter. And it was when he accidentally absorbed through his fingertips, through supposedly some sloppy lab technique, which in itself is a kind of an impossible story. Swiss chemists are probably the most obsessive-compulsive people on the planet. I mean, they have to be. Think about it. Pharmaceutical chemist does not have sloppy lab techniques. It's just unheard of. But he apparently, because LSD is so fantastically potent, the amounts that can change your consciousness dramatically is invisible, basically. You can't see it. It's so minute, 100 micrograms. 100 micrograms is 100 millionths of a gram. It's a tiny invisible speck. The only way you could see it is by putting it in something else. And but so he absorbed some. I don't know how, he said. And then he started having these incredible visions, and he, at first kind of scary because he didn't know what was happening. And then when he went home, and then he realized what was happening, then he realized what, he said, he realized, this must have something. He didn't really know what was happening in his mind, you see, because he didn't realize that it was connected to a material substance until he remembered his childhood experience. Oh, it has to do with matter. The matter I was working with, which was in fact ergot, an ergot derivative, which is in fact where LSD comes from. So, now, so I'm going to say a little bit more about LSD, but now Jung, you see, they were Swiss. Undoubtedly, Jung had heard of psychedelic drugs, and he himself said, no, I don't want to take them. He said something like, yes, because some of his followers had said, well, maybe this can give you access to the unconscious. And he said, well, I don't want to take it or need to take it. I have enough access to my unconscious. In fact, I can just as much as I can handle, basically. Well, as you well know, and some of you are maybe reading the Red Book, and where he described his many years-long experimentation, where he went into the unconscious himself and find a way to bridge from the unconscious back to his ordinary conscious life. Because that's the thing about psychedelic drugs. It's not just a matter of having an experience. Unless you can bridge the experience back into your ordinary life, then it's a waste, and it could in fact be dangerous. And at worst, it's a kind of, at the least, it's a kind of a distraction. For example, Charles Todd is a psychologist, and he interviewed a number of Buddhist meditation teachers in California, and who started studying and teaching Buddhism in the 60s, and he asked them what role psychedelics played in their practice originally and now. These are Buddhist, long-term, 20-year-long Buddhist meditation practitioners and teachers. He said, well, psychedelic experiences, one or two I had, played a very significant role initially when I was first starting off, because they gave me an experience of what was possible for consciousness to experience. And but none now, because then I realized, well, okay, but I'm not going to be taking this drug all the time. So, then start doing the meditation, which otherwise the meditation is notorious for that, because you can, meditate for decades and never have any experience. In fact, that was one of Houston Smith, the scholar who wrote The Religions of Man. He wrote a book about which he discussed Christianity and Judaism and Islam and Buddhism and Hinduism. And the first time he took psychedelics, psilocybin or LSD, he said, oh, now I really understand the essence of the religions that I've been writing about as a scholar from the outside. So it's a mysterious thing, and that kind of experience, that kind of inability to communicate something that seems very important to try to communicate is really at the core of the alchemical tradition. Because the alchemists are always saying exactly that. So, and so when you compare, Hofmann was an alchemist who focused on the material aspect. So matter and psyche and spirit, they're all on a continuum. They're not radically different, they're on a continuum, and they can be explored and are explored. And the continuum of human beings is not like, it's not abnormal. Jung, of course, had the genius to expand the conceptions, the regular psychological theories of the unconscious, like Freud and others, and into these spiritual realms. But he didn't have any direct experience of except through his dreams, of the possibility of a substance inducing a mystical experience. His method was dreams. He didn't do alchemical experiments. In other words, he read books. All his alchemical writings are about interpretations of old alchemical books, written in Latin and Greek, which he was a scholar of, and he wrote these books with enormous footnotes and absorbing, talking about the actual imagery, the imagery and thought forms and ideas triggered by the associations in that tradition, and how that could relate to the personal psychological processes of a person. Like somebody would come in and say, well, I had this weird dream where, I saw this man, he had the head of a dragon and the body of a lion, and Jung would say, let me think. And you go to the bookcase and get out a book, and there would be a picture from a 17th century text of exactly that image. And that was very significant to the person. And he said, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. Somebody else had the same image, you see. That's the thing. If you have a weird, really weird image, you might wonder, am I crazy? Am I going nuts? But if you have one other person who can say, no, I had the same image, I saw the same thing, then that means it gives it a little bit more reality. Do you see that? That's why I have a formula in one of my books. It says the subjective experience plus one equals objective. Subjective plus one equals objective. Then if you add plus 2, 3, 4, then it becomes more objective. Objective is basically shared subjective experiences. You can be objective about your subjective experience. you can be objective about subjective experience. And that is, in fact, what I think the science of consciousness needs to be, and which it is not at the moment. Because at the moment, the so-called science of consciousness limits itself to the material, trying to explain consciousness away in terms of brainwaves and molecular patterns, which is one level, yes. Doesn't explain consciousness, however. That's why they'll never explain consciousness that way, because consciousness is not something that you need to explain. So let me go on. So this is, and I'm going to come back to the book, The Expansion of Consciousness, in which I talk some more about the alchemical tradition and Jung, but let me just also go on and talk about alchemy a little bit. And in this book, this is kind of the book in which I explained the process that I call divination, which is a kind of a fusion of psychotherapy. I'm a trained psychotherapist, but I also, psychotherapists, as you know, they primarily focus their attention on the past. And in recent years, a new profession has arisen called coaching, that helps people not so much to come to terms with their past, but to help to formulate and attain their goals and their aspirations in work, in family, in at every level, whatever, including spiritual. Divination to the past is essential to healing in therapy. For example, past divination in medicine is known as diagnosis. You diagnose an illness, you want to go whether it's physical or psychological. When did I get that infection? When did I get that poison, that injury, that wound, that trauma, blah, blah, whatever it was, Oedipus complex, whatever it was, in your past. That's for the diagnostic part, but then you want the prognosis, in other words, how to heal it in the future. Now, if you're doing visioning is sort of the opposite of psychotherapy. It doesn't matter what it's like, where am I going? Where am I going with my life? What am I going to do after I grow up? That's the child wants to know. The 5-year-old says, I want to be a pilot. And so he's got a vision. Well, people go on a vision quest, go to the wilderness and fast. Vision quest. What's my vision for my life? Oh, great spirit, the Indians pray, sing songs. What's my vision for? That's not so much a job. I mean, you might have a vision for your job as well. I'm going to be a stockbroker. My vision is to make $1 million. That's a kind of a vision. We might not think it's very spiritual, and maybe it isn't, but still, it is a kind of a vision. It's a goal. It informs a goal. It informs your actions. It's future-oriented, and it's open-ended. Because you don't know whether you're going to get. That's the one difference. You can access the past through memory. You can access the future through vision. The only difference is that the visioning is probabilistic. Not the past actually happened the way it happened. Although you may have different interpretations of it, the future is probabilistic. So we all do that, visioning the future all the time. You have a vision, you're following a vision of your life, you know pretty well, almost 100% certain, but not 100%, but 98%. You're still going to be, in the near future, going to be living in the same house, married to the same person, with the same children, and the same job, and doing the similar kinds of things, pretty much, Now, you may start to go through periods when things are in upheaval, and then you don't know. Where do I want to go? Why am I actually doing this? For what purpose? So then you're asking yourself vision questions. And you may go and do have a vision quest, or may you have a vision. Like the Indians would go pray for a vision. But we might go to a consultant or family consultant and organizers and dreams, you see. There was a big insight that occurred for me about 10, 15 years ago when I was teaching about this parallelism between vision and vision in the future and memory and healing in the past, that it's like vision and memory are like two sides of the same coin, so to speak. In fact, I use the image of the Roman deity Janus, the two-headed deity, as a symbol of that process. if you're going to be doing the workshop tomorrow, then we're going to be working with this Janus principle a lot. We're going to do some processes looking into the past because it's a double, in both cases, it's a double process. You go into the past, but not just to relive the past. That wouldn't be therapeutic, would it? Just to relive the past, you could do that endlessly and it never really makes any change. You want to integrate the past into your present life, and what it means for you in your present life and your future. Because like in a traumatic memory, for example, is one that hasn't been integrated. So you go into it again in order to be able to make it part of your own self-history, your own self-concept, in order then to be free to go on with your life and not be driving your car fixated in the rearview mirror and see what's coming behind you, to overcome you. And the same with the future. If you have a future vision, well, it's not enough just to have it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, then what is it? It's like a fantasy. The fantasy is not the same as actually doing something, you see. It's kind of a substitute. So you have a vision, and then you integrate that vision into your life. The little boy who has a vision he's going to be a doctor, well, then he has to, when he grows up, he has to go to school and go to medical school and start practicing. Realizing, that's called realizing the vision. And realizing is the counterpart for the future to remembering. That's why remembering is one of my favorite words in the English language, because in the past, remembering is reconnecting. It's the opposite of dismembering. So when you remember a traumatic memory that's been forgotten or split off, then you're reconnecting something from your past history that you've been disconnected from. So, in the alchemical divination, accessing your spiritual intelligence, and you probably have heard the concept of the multiple intelligences. People say mathematical, verbal, spatial, kinesthetic, all the different intelligences in the educators and others know in learning. I think there are about 6 or 7 different. Musical is another one. Almost like specific modules in the brain for these different kinds of intelligence, rather than just one IQ. So, and I'm suggesting, along with some other people, that there's a kind of a spiritual intelligence is the intelligence that that you develop that includes the spiritual dimensions of life. And not, see, our mainstream sciences, including our mainstream psychology and social science, do not include the spiritual dimensions. And they haven't since the 17th century. That's part of the whole deal in the history of science that was made between the church and the scientists. Because the church said, you can't deal with spirit, that's our department. You can only deal with matter. And the scientists said, well, okay then. Because they wanted to keep their jobs and they wanted to keep their heads. Because if you didn't agree with them, like Giordano Bruno, he went to the stake. And Galileo knuckled under and said, because he wanted to say, well, the planet's moving. I saw it through my telescope. And he said, and the priest, the cardinal said, no, they're not moving. Otherwise, the St. Augustine would have said so, whatever. And he said, well, then, okay, if you're going to be that way about it. But he muttered under his breath, but they move. But he didn't let them hear that, you see. But they put him in jail. House arrest. You can keep looking through your stupid telescope, but just don't say the planets move. Only 500 years later in this century, the church finally apologized to Galileo. It took him a long time to come around. It's kind of weird when you think about it, so that our whole scientific conception, has negated any mention. You can't write a scientific paper and get it published if you mention God or spirit or consciousness or psyche. What is that? What is that? Is that science? It's not science. That's dogma. It's dogma. Of course, there have always been exceptions. The greatest scientists have always been completely different. Albert Hofmann was one. Einstein himself was one. Einstein himself said, to me, the most significant thing is this sense of awe that we've at the mystery, the unknown, the unknown. Not the known. The known is not so interesting. The unknown is interesting because the unknown attracts us because we want to know what we don't know. Isaac Newton, the same thing, often regarded as the most intelligent scientist ever met. He said, I may have discovered a few things, but I feel like I was like a little schoolboy who down by the ocean, found a few shiny pebbles that were kind of interesting, but beyond lay the vast boundlessness of the ocean, of which I knew nothing. That's the true humility of a true scientist, see. So, accessing your spiritual intelligence for healing and guidance. Healing always related to the past, guidance for the future. Okay. These are two alchemical mottos that are, I think, the key, or a key to understanding the alchemical process. And I think of alchemy as there are three traditional systems of transformation: shamanism, alchemy, and yoga. And they're systems of transformation at every level: physical, emotional, mental, spiritual. Spiritual and physical, emotional, mental. Shamanism, of course, the oldest, going back to the old Stone Age, involving the shamanic journey for healing and power. The way people like Michael Harner, who's a good friend of mine, an anthropologist, have brought the ancient shamanic traditions and condensing, distilling them, the essence of them. What's the core process over and above the particular symbolic language used in this condition, that condition? It's a journey that you take to find knowledge, and you may have an animal that you ride with or move with on this journey, or some kind of vehicle. You identify with an animal, you fly like a bird, or ride like a horse, or like that. In alchemy and yoga, I think of as the Eastern and Western kind of extensions of shamanic practices, because in shamanic they're also multi-level: spiritual, mental, emotional, physical. And they're different. We know the different kinds of yoga: hatha yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, meditative. But it's always the spiritual dimension included. But in the West, you see, because of the peculiar religious history in the West, India didn't have that history with yoga. The Indian scientists don't have any problems with acknowledging that spirit is fundamental. In fact, that's what Indian science always say. But in the West, you couldn't say that because it's a culture. But it's a cultural history. It's not true. It's not actually true. It's a self-imposed sort of lobotomy. Like you're not going to look at certain parts of reality. In fact, the core of reality, which is the spiritual essence. Because that was the department of the church, even although the people practicing science don't even believe in the church anymore anyway. And have long stopped following the church's commands. Weird, isn't it? The alchemists then, and alchemy, so in the 17th century, the alchemists had to stop doing, who wanted to continue practicing alchemy, had to stop doing so, or else, get burned at the stake. And same with the shamans. And the shamans were the ones that were called as witches. Witches rode on a broomstick or whatever to find healing. They were the healers. Not only women, but men too. And the church said, no, you can't do that. That's, we'll burn you at the stake. It's pretty serious. So that the tradition so alchemy split from chemistry. And chemistry is alchemy except with all spirit and psyche out, just matter. In the same way that astronomy is the same as astrology. It was originally one science, But astronomy is astrology with all the relationship of how the planetary movement relate to human consciousness and life on Earth X'd out. Because the planets are just rocks out there zipping around and anything to do with the psyche or the spirit, even though the Greeks and all the others had been saying so. And Isaac Newton, the great chemist, it was in fact an alchemist and did alchemical experiments for 30 years. But, he had such a reputation and he wrote all his stuff in secrecy. That's where the alchemists disguised everything. They wrote it in a secret language so that only they amongst themselves could read their stuff. And the people from the Inquisition couldn't read it. They thought it was just nonsense. I now think that the so-called nonsense of the alchemical text was a deliberate disguise. It was a deliberate tactic so that, and including the reputation, because the church authorities would say, these guys they call them the huffers and the puffers. They're just trying to make lead, gold out of lead. They're just after the money. And that obviously can't be done. It's obviously stupid. It's impossible. And therefore, they're just greedy, stupid people like that. And the alchemists sort of accepted that reputation because it meant that people left them alone, except for the people that actually knew and wanted to practice what they were practicing. And they didn't talk about it. They talked about it in a secret code. So they had to write these books. They couldn't publish in the scientific journals of the time. They had to write it in secret and pass it along in secret. And then, of course, in the course of time, many of them also would forget the language and so a lot of the language is kind of garbled, but also not, as I think I'll be able to show you. So these two core alchemical mottos, one is natura naturans, is nature being natural. Nature doing its natural thing. Nature being natural. And that's, the core of a core healing tradition, stream. It's going back to Hippocrates, going back to Indian, the healer doesn't do anything. He just strengthens the body's own natural healing capacity, regenerative capacity. That's what the body does through nutrition, breathing, exercise, plants, massage, whatever. This natural means strengthening the body has its own. The human being has its own natural healing, regenerative capacities. Just strengthen it, natural ways. That's a very honorable tradition that exists to this day. Various like herbal medicine, homeopathy. Homeopathy is a classic example of Indian medicine, Chinese medicine, acupuncture. It's the same idea. Just stimulate the meridians. Stimulate the body's own natural healing energy. The body knows how to heal itself. Of course it does, otherwise it wouldn't be here. It wouldn't have evolved if it didn't know how to heal itself. It doesn't need interventions except in very few cases. If you have a broken bone, then you have to set the bone. Then the body heals itself. You put the bones back together and they'll grow together. But the alchemists also had another saying, and that's opus contra naturam. Opus is the work. So opus is like the alchemical term that corresponds to, in shamanism, the journey, the shamanic journey. The core process, the core method in alchemy is the opus, the work. So the work is consciously and intentionally working with the psychochemistry of your being, the multi-level chemistry of your being. And yes, the alchemists did take medicines, and they didn't make powders. But they also meditated, and they also consulted the planets. Paracelsus, did astrology. Like Indian doctors to this day, they consult the horoscope of the patients. A lot of the shamans in Asia too, also they do combine shamanism with astrology, horoscopes. And so opus contra naturam, seemingly the opposite of naturans, nature doing naturally. So why opus? How could the opus be against? The way I interpret that would be that nature also our nature becomes habitual. We have habits of thought, habits of the body, and that become unconscious habits. Psychologists know this. and to develop the unconscious. See, in Eastern philosophy, now this is a big difference between Eastern and Western philosophies about consciousness. You know, we in the West we always think, well, consciousness is sort of the base state. You know, like we're all conscious, so we have consciousness, we say, except when we're unconscious. And the Indian traditions, including Buddhism, Hinduism, all of them, say no, the default condition is unconsciousness. It's called avidya, not knowing, unconsciousness. And consciousness can only be developed through certain practices called yoga and meditation. Mindfulness. That's why you sit in meditation, mindfully thinking, not just unconsciously thinking. And you practice mindfulness. At first you practice it not doing anything, just sitting. Just sitting and observing your breath, mindfully breathing. And then you extend that to mindfully eating. And then you move up to, as you get better at it, mindfully, consciously thinking about things. Very difficult to do. So it's a very different way of thinking about it. So the opus, the way that I think of the opus is like in inertia. The inertia principle in psychology and consciousness means there's always a tendency to run down and lose consciousness. Not being attentive, not attending. Else, how do things happen, right? How do accidents happen? How do we spill wine on our clothes? How do we crash into another car? How do we lose our temper and start hitting somebody or yelling at somebody? Not conscious. We're slipping into unconscious. So opus contra naturam means like it's like the Sufis and people like Gurdjieff. Like you challenge your own unconscious tendencies and wake up, self-remember. Gurdjieff used to say self-remember, remembering who you are. Would you do the kind of would we do the things that we afterwards regret if we were conscious? No, obviously not. That's why we have to say, I regret. I'm sorry I did that. I wasn't thinking. I'm sorry I did that. I wasn't thinking. I forgot myself, we say. We forget ourselves all the time. So that's the idea of the opus contra naturam. So both are true. Both are mottos that are appropriate. Okay. So here's one of these mysterious images in the alchemists that appears in an alchemical book, I forget which one, 17th century probably, Body, Mind, and Spirit. But I think that's a cover. What I think, the way I interpret that image, I mean, body, mind, spirit, I think is it's a disguise. They put false labels on their images. This has to do with developmental psychology. This encourages you to look at the life cycle. It's a young man, a middle-aged man, and an old man. And this is similar to the very frequent images of the triple goddess. The goddess as a woman, as an old woman, as a crone, and as a young maiden. The goddess imagery, the triple goddess is much more widespread somehow. The triple god is much more rare, but it does appear, and this is an example of it. Except they don't call it that; they call it that's something about body, mind, and soul. So. But the alchemical images, the image itself speaks for itself, you see. And the people who had been trained and been studying the tradition would know how to interpret it and look at it as guidance for the thing. But it would be guidance. Look at the life cycle. And that's why in my book on alchemical divination, I have a whole chapter on looking at the life cycle. The stage of life that you're in, the kind of work that you do. We have these three, you can think of these three main stages. The youth stage, which is up to the Saturn return. Childhood, adolescence, up to the Saturn return, which is the late 20s, 28, 29. Planet Saturn, which is time, comes back to its original position. And then that's the period of growth and development in your life. You're learning and growing, expanding consciousness and developing your capabilities and skills and interests, and gradually becoming more independent, building new relationships like that. Then 30s, 40s, and 50s, roughly, and this is very rough, of course, it's not always like that. Then you're like the mature age, you're a functioning adult, people get married, have a family, start practice, finish medical school, finish law school, start practicing. Very different changes. The Saturn return. In my workshop, I often ask people, and maybe may do this tomorrow, to think about the Saturn return in their life, the period 27, 28, 29. That's 3 or 4 or 5 year period, usually without exception, always without exception, I would say, the most fundamental turning point in everybody's life. In terms of where they live, who they live with, what they do, how they spend most of their time, like that. So that's, and then the elder phase starts at the late 50s. You see the second Saturn return, 58, 59. So then the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond, the elder period. That's, again, different from the middle period. Then maybe by that time your children are grown up or almost grown up, and maybe you retire. Traditionally, you might retire and go, become more spiritual, maybe withdraw from some of the things. Of course, nowadays, people can start new jobs. And so, like, looking at the phase of life, that's what this alchemical image points to, I think. So now we'll get into some of these very strange sayings of the alchemists. And one of the key things, of course, is what they call the stone, or the lapis philosophorum, the stone of the wise, the stone of the philosophers. And if you look through the alchemical text, as I did in my book there, the expansion of consciousness, the first one, the first whole chapter is where I found a number of these definitions where they try to define what the stone is. And it gets very, very strange. Our stone is found in all mountains, all trees, all herbs and animals, and all human beings. So right away it's not like a stone, like a rock in the usual way. But so what is it? It wears many different colors, contains the 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, which I relate to the material body substance of the human body, the water being the emotional, fire being the perceptual, nervous, visionary, and air being the mental. That's pretty universal kind of symbolic connection. And man has been designated a microcosm. So that's the old Hermetic principle of the as above, so below. The human being is a microcosm of the greater universe, the universe within. Or this is from the 16th century, the glory of the world. They always give these alchemical texts these incredibly effusive names, you see. Something very precious. This stone is under you, near you, above you, and around you. So it's clearly not the case. You can't just say, well, it's a certain kind of stone or substance, or even as some of my friends and colleagues in the so-called psychedelic movement seem to think it's LSD, obviously. The stone is LSD. Well, I'm sorry, but it's not. LSD is a crystallized substance. Yes, it is a crystallized substance. But this stone can be under you, near you, above you, and around you. Found in all herbs and animals, and in human beings. So I'm just going to leave these there for you to think about. And questions, ask yourself what it means, what it might mean. I like the phrase ask yourself or ask myself, because when you say I ask myself, you realize that you assume, you think, you believe that there is a part of you that knows more than you do. Right? Otherwise, why would you be asking yourself? You're asking somebody who knows more than you do. You're asking your higher self, as we might say. It's like, or the ego is asking the self. And when you ask, you make yourself receptive. That's why I think questions are more interesting than answers. Because when you have the answer, then it's like you close the book. You finish the research project, you close the book. Oh, okay, now I know that now, put it in the shelf. If you ask a question, then you are still searching. That's the whole thing about Zen, right? The Zen guy says, go, meditate. What's the sound of one hand clapping? The guy comes back and says, well, it's so-and-so, and Zen master gives him a whack, says, oh, that's not it, go meditate some more. Every answer he gives, that's not the answer, because there is no answer. The point is to ask the question. So questions open you up, keep you searching. Okay. Hermes Trismegistos. Now there's Hermes the god. Hermes the Trismegistos is this kind of legendary, semi-legendary figure, a high-level initiate. He lived, who knows, Egypt. Nobody knows exactly when. Maybe second, around the turn of the millennia, 3rd, 4th century, before, after. Nobody knows exactly. Obviously, a whole school. He initiated a school. It's a school of the Hermetic tradition, which is also the alchemical, is the Hermetic tradition. And it's a secret tradition. It's an underground tradition. You don't talk about it. The reason you don't talk about it is not because you want to, you love secrets per se, or is because it wouldn't be understood, which is in fact the case. It wouldn't be understood unless you go through the processes that would help you to understand it, you see. Because it involves practices, like yogic practices. You don't really understand it. It's like, chemists talking to one another. It's hermetic, because if you're not a chemist, you don't understand it, the language. You don't know what they're talking about, what the experiences are, what the observations are that they've made. But Hermes says the sun is the father, the moon the mother, the wind bears it in its womb, and is nursed by the earth. So of the 4 elements, fire and air are male, masculine, by the alchemists, polarized, and water and earth, feminine, because fire and air rise up, water and earth sink down. In psychological, you say in terms of the 4 functions, I would say air and fire corresponds to thinking and intuition, and water and earth to feeling and sensing. Alchemical texts are filled with multiple illustrations of the 4 elements and various combinations. So the sun is the father, the moon the mother, the basic polarity, which also is the right-left polarity. If you look at alchemical drawings, of which there'll be one next, you'll see the male is always, it's the right side of the body also. That's the same as in yoga. See Ida and Pingala. Yoga on the right side is Pingala, the sympathetic nerve system, the left side, the parasympathetic moon, feminine, Pingala side. So, and then the conjunctio, see, is the integration of the fire and the sun. Fire and water. The wind bears it in its womb. Why? That's a strange image. First of all, the wind is male. Wind has a womb. And the way I interpret that, in fact, there's another image of it. But nursed by the earth, let me go on. Okay, so the next one is this one. This is an image of from a series of images illustrating the conjunctio. The conjunctio is Jung wrote a 700-page book on the Mysterium Conjunctionis. It's kind of a core integrative alchemical process. It has many stages and many aspects. A series of images in alchemical books showing different stages of the conjunctio. It's not just a one-shot deal. Integrating of the male, female, sun, moon, masculine, feminine images, solar, lunar in the body. So here you have the male standing on the sun, on the right, and you're looking at it, it's on the left, but think of this as a picture of a human being. See, this is inside a person, this is not 2 people, this is 1 person. So on your right side, that's the solar side. Your left side is the lunar side. each and she's standing on the moon, he's standing on the sun, and then they're giving each other their they're giving each other their left hand. So they're making a first awkward gauche. You know, the term gauche means left. Contact. They're getting acquainted, the male-female side of you. That's the first stage. And they have these staff with flowers, and then there's a bird with a star coming from above, inspiring their getting together. Does that make sense to you? So, now, the wind has carried in his belly, see? He's got a fetus in his belly. Why? Because wind, air, is masculine, you know, but, so that seems paradoxical. But air is mind. The process of transformation, every process of transformation or healing has to start in the mind. You have to have the idea first. You have the idea. Otherwise, think about the word conception or concept means idea, and it also means conception. Right? And prior to birth, there has to be a conception, where the male seed and the female seed come together, called conception, and takes root. If you want to do anything, even self-transform yourself, become enlightened, you first have to have the idea that you want to be enlightened. This is not going to happen accidentally or sort of by the way. Obviously, it's like the intention in the mind. So that's how I would interpret that image. The wind has carried it in its belly, and its nurse is the earth. You have the idea, but then you have to nourish the idea of transformation. In this case, the idea of transformation or enlightenment. You have to nourish it, feed it, protect it. It's not going to happen by itself. You can have the idea and never do it, then the idea just goes flying off like some other idea. And she's Mother Earth, you see. The earth, the mother is always the earth, and the earth is always the mother. All life arises from the earth. Okay, so our substance is openly displayed before the eyes of all, yet it is not known. So obviously it's not a particular object. Two people could be looking at the same thing, and one is seeing it, the stone, and the other is not. It has to do something with your perception, with how you look at things. Learned doctors have it before their eyes every day, but they do not understand it because they never attend to it. I like the titles of these. It's a 17th century text, The New Chemical Light. Right? This is when alchemy and chemistry were still one substance, looking at it from the point of view of chemistry. So of course, in every psychological process, the way we would say it nowadays, of course, every single psychological process, every thought, every feeling, every perception, there's chemistry going on, of course. And there's whole sciences and neuropsychochemistry and, studying it in detail. But they study it only with the external methods. They don't study it in themselves. And that's what the Hermeticists did. They studied it in themselves. And they regarded their own body, their own multi-level psycho-cosmic organism as the laboratory in which you do the work that you're doing, that you're learning. And of course, you also do it out there, and you have potions that you take and drink and powders and and apply in your healing with animals and people and But the laboratory the opus is done inside. The healer, it's the same principle as the healer, heal thyself, right? Heal thyself. You can't heal somebody else of a liver disease if you've got a liver disease yourself, obviously. You first heal the liver yourself, you see. Then you'll be able to, then you would go to the doctor that knows how to heal it. Obviously, he's known how to heal it. Okay, so that's another stage of the conjunctio. See, here they're already the two sides of you. Then they're sitting in the vessel. This is the vessel. It's like a hot tub, except it's not a Mill Valley hot tub where you're sitting with your partner. It's the hot tub of your body. The vessel is the body. Actually, I would say the body and energy field. Because the subtle energy body field, which extends 10, 15, 20, 50 feet out in every direction, is as much part of your vessel as the physical body. So they're sitting in water, and the hot water is melting the differences between them, is melting the separation between them. And they've taken their clothes off, which means they're no longer covering. This is what the yogic traditions call coverings. I forget what the name they have is. Kleshas, obstructions, blockages. Or Reichian bodywork, muscle tensions, armoring that prevents different parts of your body from, because the muscles are tight from the energy freely flowing between the two sides and between all the different parts of the organ. So you're sitting in a hot tub using the warmth and the heat of the solutio, what the alchemists call this process, the solutio, which means dissolving the tensions. In order to allow these two core energetic male, female, yin, yang, sun, moon parts of your being come closer together. And notice here it's the right hand of one to the left hand of the other, left hand of one receiving the right hand from the other. See, this is a much more closer conjunction of the two. And now this thing, the stone, is extracted from you. So that shows very clearly it's something in you. Something physical, psychophysical, cellular, who knows. You are its ore, like a precious metal extracted. Has to be, like gold has to be extracted from the ore, not until it is. When you have experienced this, the love and desire for it will be increased in you. And I love this one too, 18th century, Gerald Dorn. We cannot be resolved of any doubt except by experiment. See, these people were real true scientists. Don't take it for granted. It's not a matter of belief. Test it out yourself. See for yourself. Practice it. The point of yoga is not to put forth some theory. Same with shamanism. Test it, apply it, use it. And there's no better way to make it on ourselves. Heal thyself. Okay. Then, so here's another stage of the conjunction. So here, the legs, the torso, the lower torso, upper torso are already conjoined into one. But the heads, the organism still has two heads. Because that's the hardest part, because the brain is so complicated. Integrating the two brain hemispheres is very difficult. It takes a long time. Much easier to integrate the heart and the liver and the stomach and the different other parts of the organism relatively can be harmonious. But harmonizing the two brain hemispheres is very difficult because it's so complex. It takes a long time. So there's an intermediate stage, the two-headed being. You could make some weird Hollywood movie about that. They do make weird Hollywood movies about it all the time. Okay, it is called perfect. Perfect means complete. Perfected means complete. Because it has in itself the nature of mineral, vegetable, and animal. For the soul is triple and one, having four natures. So that shows right there, see? It's not just a human psychological process. When the pure and essential elements are joined together in a loving equilibrium, as they are in our stone, they are inseparable and immortal, like the human body in paradise. See, you can see all kinds of questions that arise. Oh, we have a human body in paradise? Obviously, it has to be like your human body in paradise, not somebody else's. Okay, and this is another beautiful image of the conjunctio, as the image of the marriage of fire and water. See, this makes it very clear you're not talking about anatomy, you're talking about energies. So the fire on the right, fire and water, and the water on the left, they're conjoining, the arms are conjoining, they're not really arms, they're not human arms, it's not a human form, just the face and head, enough indicated so that you can see, oh, this is in us. Maybe you could say this is an image of the modern physiologists might say this is a sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. You know, we have these two parallel autonomic nervous systems. One is more energetic, daytime sympathetic, doing and acting and fiery. The parasympathetic is more feminine, relaxing, nighttime, that kind of thing. The most ancient secret, natural, incomprehensible, heavenly, blessed, beatified, and triune, universal stone of the sages. This is reminiscent. I don't know if you've ever read some of these Buddhist texts or Hindu texts when they start talking about the different stages of enlightenment. Where they just go on after on, phrase after phrase in praise of these realms of being and realms of consciousness that can be attained through these practices. And then I love this term, the Sophic hydrolith. Hydrolith means water stone. Water like hydro and lith, stone. And Sophic again is wisdom, the water stone of wisdom. And that shows a stone, so again, it's paradoxical. It's not just a rock. It's not just a rock. It's a water stone. So it's solid like stone, but flows like water. So what is like that? There is a consciousness like that. It's a state of consciousness. This is one of my teachers said I asked him, what is it? He said, the philosopher's stone is not a magical object. It is the magnificent condition resulting from reaching objectivity. The ability to be objective about fact, to know and perceive the hard fact, stone, of a given situation as it actually is, without illusion and distortion. Another analogy would be like in the Eastern Buddhist tradition, they talk about Vajra consciousness. And Vajra is both diamond and lightning. Diamond, the hardest substance known, stone and all it, the hardest substance known, and lightning, the most brilliant, bright light. Here's a modern painting by somebody showing the conjunctio of fire and water, but both female. See, the way different ways of doing the conjunctio is not always necessarily the same, because males and females can be fiery and watery, and so can males, and This is a Janus, a Roman coin. The Roman used the imagery of Janus looking in the two directions as the imagery of I interpret that as being, it was the coin of the realm. And Janus was the gatekeeper of the gods, who sat at heaven's gate and paid attention to who was coming and going. The gods and goddesses in their various excursions, Janus always knew. And it's the month of Janus, it's the root for January. The month of January, the winter solstice, and the turning point of the year. It's also the root for janitor, the gatekeeper, the doorkeeper. He sees you where you're going. And it's a coin of the realm. You pay to cross the border, pay the customs man, pay the border crossing, pay admission, pay the price. This is just another chemical image showing the threefold division of, in this case, a threefold division of the body energy field. Usually having, like in Taoism, you have, the way I think of it, it's the head upper throat head is one thing, more thinking awareness. The middle part is more like heart, abdomen, heart awareness, feeling awareness. Lower part, abdomen, pelvic, more like sensory body kind of awareness. And the alchemists have those kind of triple images, very, very widespread all over, including all the Buddhist stupas, with the cube and then the sphere and then the triangle. Anyway. And this is from my book, The Alchemical Divination. So this is the way I work with the traditional chakras in the middle, but like the Taoists, I talk about 3 chambers: upper chamber, middle chamber, cave of the heart, little cauldron, pelvic abdominal area, and then there's centers in the legs. There's not just 7 chakras. I mean, there's 11 or 13 chakras depending. And there's chakras above the head and below the feet. But this is the idea. And the energies in each of these main chambers is slightly different, and you work with them all, balancing them, refining them like that. And this is an alchemical image. This is just a kind of mysterious image. Just to give you an example of, I forget actually which text it was, some text from the 17th century. They have these 4 balls of fire standing in a landscape, and it says, the only text is, a 4-fold fireball controls this work. Okay, here's how I interpret that. That's the text. Atalanta Fugiens, 1618, 17th century, early 17th century. This 4 balls of fire is a yogic process, working with fire in 4 main segments of the body. The 3 main segments that we just saw, the abdomen, pelvis, the middle abdomen, the middle chest area, the throat and head, and then one above the head. So it's a alchemical emblem describing a yogic process. But see, this is how the alchemical practitioners would pass their yoga. They couldn't actually describe it as an actual practice, because then the church would be down there breathing down their neck and busting them and putting them in jail or burning them at the stake. So they just made it symbolic. It's just a symbolic picture, you figure it out. And what gave me the key, what finally confirmed for me the key, is the outhouse. See the outhouse next to the lowest sphere? It's the pelvic. That's like a little key that's built in. And this is another one, you've probably seen this, the serpent devours its own tail. And the serpent is an energy, the serpentine. Kundalini is called a serpent. It's kind of the energy that goes around this, goes up, the Kundalini is supposed to go up the spine from the root chakra to the crown chakra. But in the Taoist tradition, they have a completely different tradition. They have, yes, there's an energy that goes up, and then it goes up the back and comes over the top and goes down the front. That's what they call it, up the back, over the top, comes down the front. There's a meridian that comes down here from the nose and goes down to the pelvic, and then there's another meridian that goes up the back, over the top of the head, and they both meet there, as you can see here. In the upper image here, the Ouroboros image. The governor vessel yang goes up the energy goes up the back, and the yin conception vessel goes up the front. And they meet at this point, the point of consciousness, above the upper lip, point 28. This is where I had a revelation, because I had a friend of mine and we were talking about this work, and she's an acupuncturist, and she pointed out that this point, where the 2 channels meet, the yang governor vessel from up the back, associated with heaven, and the yin governor vessel, conception vessel going up the front, meet at that point. And that's the point called the point of consciousness. You stimulate that point in acupuncture when somebody's unconscious, or drunk, or in a coma. Interesting, isn't it? That's exactly the point. So I think the image, and that's the image of the serpent with its own tail in its mouth. In fact, you could try that yourself. Touch this point right now. It's a kind of additional, let me see, right? Let me see, or let me think. Makes the connection between heaven and earth, the yang and the yin. Let me remember. See, in the book, The Alchemical Divination, I have some examples of how this is used, and it's used to revive people if somebody's gone unconscious or drunk, like first aid. Might be useful to remember sometime. So these are 4 statements that are sort of summarize the basic principles of the work that I call alchemical divination. And it has to do with memory, as I mentioned, memory going into the past, but integrating it, bringing it back to the present. So intentional memory with conscious integration is remembering and leads to healing and increased wholeness. Unconscious memory, like without integration, is flashback, regression. Somebody's suddenly back in their childhood trauma and acting from that. And leads to hopelessness or useless nostalgia. You just say, you think about the good old days when I was happy and didn't have to worry about a thing. My parents took care of me, whatever. Intentional vision with conscious integration is inspiration. Inspiration means spirit coming in. And leads to realization and creative expression. In creative expression, you make the vision real. Unconscious vision without integration is fantasy and leads to loss of faith and pointless distractions. Now, not to say that fantasy is bad. If you have a fantasy and then you write a book about it, like what's that book series called? The Harry Potter, and become a millionaire and write dozens of books and inspires people and gives great stories. Absolutely, that's a way of realizing that vision. Or compose music or paint it, and so that's completely different. But if you just think about it, someday I'll do that, and it leads to loss of faith and pointless distraction. People don't know, what am I doing with my life? I'll go to this thing and go to that thing, like that. So with that, I thank you for your attention.